Hey, it's Lauren Kime here, back with section 4 of our Introduction to Commercial Real Estate program, and we're going to be talking about commercial leases. Now, leases are absolutely integral to virtually every aspect of commercial real estate. You may ask why. A commercial agent or broker obviously needs to understand leases in order to lease and negotiate space for their clients, whether their client is a landlord or a tenant. But additionally, leases and the various methods of building costs are split between landlords and tenants. And by the way, there are a lot of them. We're going to talk about them today. Are an integral part of determining a property's value because it all comes back to how much money is the landlord making on the property. And the sales price of most income producing properties is directly related to the income that the property or building generates after expenses. Now, a full understanding of leases and how they function is necessary to properly advise your commercial investors and your property sellers. One caveat to this program, again, is to remind you, the viewer, of course, that I am neither an attorney nor an accountant. So the clauses I run through with you today are not intended to constitute legal advice or opinion. I'm trying to introduce leasing concepts and to guide you in the potential strategies to be successful in your career. So let me ask, what is a commercial lease? You might be called on to represent the interest of the owner or the landlord in procuring a tenant and negotiating a lease with that tenant, or to represent a tenant or end user to locate and acquire the lease of a property. Or you might be managing a property for a property owner. Lease contracts spell out the landlord and tenant names, the length of contract, the amount of the lease payments, how the lease payment will be made, and who is responsible for maintenance and operation of the property. Lease contracts can also be negotiated to include almost every contingency conceivable. And some of the clauses that are common we'll be running through today, including escalation of lease payments over time, whether or not those lease payments include a percentage of sales of the tenant, and so on. And many end users of commercial real estate prefer to lease space rather than purchasing. An end user may lease because their location they desire is only available for lease, such as in a prominent shopping center or a particular corner location. A user might lease space because they don't have the capital, the down payment, and the closing costs to buy that property, or they might have a strategy that'll require them to move within a few years, and they'd rather not be tied to a particular building or location. Other users determine the net present value to their organization in a lease versus buy analysis and try and figure out what's going to be better for them. Now, owners or landlords lease properties in order to obtain a cash flow from the property as a return on the investment they have in that property. And because commercial realtors can represent either side of the transaction, it's important to understand the objectives and points of view of both landlords and tenants. The end user or tenant's objectives in leasing a property are the first thing we'll talk about. And although a tenant is willing to pay a fair market rent for space that properly meets their needs, that user of the space, that tenant, naturally wants to pay as little as they possibly can to lease that property and like the owner to cover as much of the common area expense as possible. Remember back on day one, we talked about common area expense and how landlords try and somehow get that cost recaptured from the tenants. Now, obviously, a lower lease payment means more money in the tenant's pocket. A tenant is also seeking the right location and a space that's suitable for their particular use. Other contingencies that might benefit a tenant include that the landlord will maintain the building or space and pay all building costs and repairs. That puts the risk of escalating payments like taxes and insurance and the expenses of unforeseen repairs directly on the landlord. The lease payment should be locked in for a long period of time, and the landlord will maintain that building or space. And they want the landlord to renovate that space to conform to whatever the needs of the tenants are, or at least to finance that renovation. And we'll talk about how to do that in a little bit. And the tenant wants to have the right to sublet the space if they run into problems and don't need all of their space. Tenant's also going to want the right to purchase that property at some future time, or the landlord might not sell the property without giving the tenant the first right of refusal. And that tenant will have the right to automatically renew the lease. The tenant also wants the ability to expand their space at some future point if the need arises. Sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Well, there's also the landlord's perspective, and they've got objectives as well. The landlord or the owner of the property is looking for the highest rent payment they possibly can because they want to maximize their return on investment in that property. and a tenant who's willing to cover any increases in cost for the property they occupy, like taxes, insurance, utilities as they go up, in order to avoid the erosion of the owner's income as the cost of ownership rises. Owners are also want to have tenants that'll be stable, long-term tenants, so that the owner doesn't have to search for a new tenant and re-enter the property, re-rent the property. And additionally, owners seek tenants who are going to maintain the property and hopefully even improve the property over time at their own expense. Some of the other contingencies that landlords want are an escalation of lease payments over time. They want the tenant to maintain the building or space. They want the tenant to make any improvements to the property, and all improvements are required to be approved by the landlord. And they'd like an agreement that the tenant will pay all or part of variable costs of owning that building, including utilities and hopefully a percentage of maintenance, taxes, and insurance. Now, of course, that tenant and landlord are diametrically opposed in a lot of spaces, but there are points at which landlords and tenants agree. Tenants and landlords both desire financial health of one another. Let me explain it this way. If a tenant is not financially solid, the landlord might lose that tenant and have to go out and re-rent the space, leaving it potentially vacant for a period of time. The landlord might also incur costs to find a new tenant or to improve the space. Worse, a landlord may have to evict a tenant, losing time and money in the court system while trying to remove the tenant from their property. And similarly, a tenant wants a financially healthy landlord because they don't want the negative impact of a foreclosure on the building or lack of maintenance by the landlord. Some of the other areas where landlords and tenants agree include having a clearly written lease that lays out exactly what the terms of the lease are, the amount of rent, what the rent includes, and the subdivision of responsibilities for maintenance utilities between the landlord and tenant. When you're quoting rental rates are typically quoted as an annual figure. For example, if the lease rate is $16 per square foot for office, that usually means $16 per square foot per year, or about $1.25 per square foot per month. So if I want to figure out how much a tenant is paying monthly to compute that tenant's monthly payment, the rate needs to be multiplied by the square footage of the leasable area and then divided by 12 months. So let me give you an example. If the rent per year is $16 per square foot and they are renting 2,625 square feet, we multiply 16 times 25 or 2625, and it's $42,000 a year. We're going to take that $42,000 a year, we're going to divide it by 12, and we find out that it's $3,500 a month. That's what they're paying each month. Now, for tenants leasing a multi-use property, a multiple use property, such as a property that's partially office space and partially warehouse, the rate is generally a blended rate between the two uses. Rather than quoting a rate of $16 per square foot for the office and $8 per square foot for the warehouse, the rate is generally blended between the two uses. And there are many types of lease payments. Leases are often defined by the type of payment negotiated between the landlord and tenant. I went through some of these on our first day, but let me run back through it. Although there are variations in the terms, and all portions of a lease are negotiable, the most commonly used terms for the various lease payments include gross lease, net lease, and triple net lease. So let me run through what those are. A gross lease, also known as a full service lease, is a lease where the tenant, by the way, when I give different terms, it's because different parts of the country and different agencies in commercial aren't like residential. A split level isn't a split level isn't a split level. A gross lease in New York is a full service lease in Los Angeles in some cases. So it's an all-inclusive rate where the tenant pays one fee, meaning that the landlord is going to pay for all expenses to occupy, maintain, and operate the property. And these expenses paid by the landlord include the utilities like water, sewer, and electric. They include the property taxes, the insurance, property maintenance, including snow removal and lawn care, repairs, and any common area expenses or security costs. Now, on the other hand, a net lease is probably the most confused leasing term in the world because some use the term to indicate a lease where the tenant pays their rent plus their utilities, and the landlord pays all the building expenses, including taxes and insurance. And others use the term to identify a lease where the tenant pays the rent, plus a portion of the taxes, and the landlord covers the cost of utilities, repairs, and maintenance. And still others use the term interchangeably with triple net, which means the tenants pay all expenses and repairs. So if you're in a suburban area leasing an office or retail property and the utilities can't really easily be split between the units, The definition of net lease is likely to mean that the tenant is paying one item above the lease, which is often a percentage of taxes. In a suburban location, where utilities are very easily split in many cases between units, the definition of net lease is a lease where the tenant pays the utilities like water, sewer, electric, and heat, and the landlord pays all the building expenses like taxes and insurance. And the tenant and landlord separate the cost of maintenance of the property based on what's inside the space versus what's outside the space or common area, which are provided to the landlord. A net lease is where the tenant pays for utilities and a percentage of property taxes and insurance in addition to rent. Their obligation for taxes and insurance are generally based on their percentage occupancy of the building or property. So generally, the tenant also pays for any repairs and maintenance made inside their unit, and the landlord usually covers the maintenance on the exterior. Triple net lease, that's where the tenant pays all expenses for the property with exception to capital improvements. Under a triple net lease or a net lease, the tenant pays all the utilities, electric, water, sewer, and heat, the property maintenance, and the property taxes and insurance. If the tenant is only leasing a portion of the property, the landlord might prorate the cost of maintenance, taxes, and insurance by the percentage leased by the tenant. This is often done through the use of CAM fees or common area maintenance fees. Under a triple net lease, the landlord is still typically responsible for structural repairs. And there is one other one under net type leases, and it's called an absolute net lease. And an absolute net lease is where the tenant covers anything. That includes structural repairs, and it's most often associated with long-term leases. We also talked the other day about something called a percentage lease, and that's a common type of lease found in malls and high-end retail leases. A percentage lease requires a tenant to pay a negotiated percentage of the tenant's gross monthly or yearly sales made at that location, in addition to a fixed minimum monthly rental payment. The example we used on day one was that the tenant is paying a rental rate of $24,000 per year plus 3% over a break point of $800,000. That's what they pay in addition to their normal rent. You'll also find modified net leases or hybrid net leases, and that's any negotiated lease under which the landlord and tenant agree to share some portion of the expenses of utilities and building maintenance and taxes and insurance. And we'll talk about a few examples of that in a little bit. And common area fees. We've also mentioned this several times over the past day, but common area maintenance fees, also known as CAM fees, are the tenant's prorated portion of all maintenance expenses for their property. Under a triple net lease, part or all of the cost of maintaining the building might be negotiated to that tenant. And this direct pass-through of expenses from landlord to tenant allows the landlord to receive a steady return on the property without concern of rising maintenance costs on the. So CAM fees are usually used to cover parking lot maintenance and snow removal, landscape, building security, exterior lighting, and even structural maintenance and repairs. In some cases, landlords estimate the CAM charges and build those estimated charges into a lease as a fixed amount, such as it's going to cost you $8 per square foot per year in CAM charges. And then the ad might run and say that you have a $12 per square foot rental rate plus a $6 or an $8 per square foot CAM charge. An alternate method is the actual expenses are calculated and the tenant is then pays on a per square foot basis based on the percentage of rentable space that tenant occupies. Under the second method, for example, if a tenant occupies 5,000 square feet and they're in a building that contains 100,000 square feet of rentable space, the tenant is responsible for 5% of the total common area maintenance charges. So whatever that charge is, they divide it out and that tenant is responsible for 5%. Now you might also hear the term expense stop or base stop. Now, an expense stop is designed to create a limit or a cap on the expenses paid by one party or another. If an expense stop is utilized to benefit a landlord, the lease includes a clause that the landlord will cover building expenses or operating expenses on that building up to a specified amount called an expense or an expense stop. The tenant then becomes responsible for any operating expenses above that expense stop, above that specified amount, and that's generally stated on a per square foot basis. So let me give you an example. If a lease specifies that a tenant needs to pay a rental rate of $24 a square foot per year, as long as expenses don't exceed $8 per square foot of rentable area. So they're doing a gross lease of $24 a square foot, as long as the expenses don't go over $8 per square foot. The tenant then has to pay their proportional share of expenses above that $8 per square foot. So if a building contains 100,000 square feet of rentable area, the landlord is responsible for up to $800,000, or the first $800,000 in annual operating expenses, $8 times 100,000 square feet. If the actual annual operating expenses are really high this year, they're $1 million. Since the landlord's portion of the expense is limited to $800,000, then $200,000 of those expenses shall be shared by the tenants by their proportionate use of the building. So if the tenant occupies 20,000 square feet of that 100,000 square foot building, 100,000 square foot of rentable space, that tenant is responsible for 20% of the overage, or about $40,000. So let me do that slowly, because I want you to understand this, because we do run into this fairly often, particularly in the urban areas, in the cities. The landlord sets an expense stop. So the landlord says, listen, we will pay $8 per square foot of the expenses. If it goes beyond that, the tenants are responsible for the difference. 100,000 square foot building means $8 times 100,000 square feet. The landlord is capping their exposure, their expenses, at 800,000. There might be an overage. That means whatever the actual expense is minus what the landlord's expense stop is, their maximum, their ceiling, is the overage. In this case, if it's $1 million this year, $1 million minus the $800,000 they promised to pay leaves a $200,000 overage. If the tenant's portion of that space is 20%, 20,000 square feet out of 100,000 square feet, then the tenant has to pay 20% of that $200,000, or about $40,000. Now, not to confuse you, there's an alternative to an expense stop called a base stop. And a base stop is another method to cap the landlord contribution to the actual expenses from a base year, which is the year the tenant takes possession of the space. A tenant is then responsible for any increases over the expenses of the first year. So if the expenses in the first year are $100,000 for their portion of the space, and then they rise to $105,000 in the second year, the tenant's responsible for that $5,000 overage. And let me explain why this happens. If you're in a skyscraper in New York or Boston or Washington, D.C., and you've got tenants that are changing regularly, the landlord is covering some expense of the building in most cases. And because of that, they want to limit their exposure, their liability, if for some reason one of their tenants uses a lot of utility. So as each lease comes in, they will cap their expenses, and in this case it's called a base stop. So again, that is for each unit, they have a certain amount that the landlord will pay up to, and then if it goes beyond that, they're going to be responsible for that overage. Alternately, a reverse expense stop, just to confuse you more, requires that the tenant pays the operating expenses up to a certain level, or an expense stop level, and the landlord becomes responsible for expenses above that level. Most often, an expense stop or base stop is used to protect a landlord from escalating expenses of a building. The most likely sales price of a building to an investor, of course, is based on the net operating income. Remember, they're going to calculate a cap rate. And that expense stop helps to curb or stop the erosion of the net operating income and shift the risk of rising costs over to the tenant. So with all these different types of leases and all these different types of ways that expenses are handled, how do we really compare leases? Let me explain effective rent, because there's a couple of ways to do it. We want to know what clients are really paying once all the different fees and costs of occupancy are added together. And one method of determining the occupancy cost for a tenant is to compute the effective rent. And effective rent is most often described in a price per square foot, like everything else in leases. The calculation is to add the entire base rent, the CAM fees if there are any, and any other tenant paid expenses for the period of the lease, including escalations, and then subtract any cash allowances and free rent, and then divide by the term of the lease and by the square footage. So effective rent is per square foot over the term of the lease. And this doesn't work real well if you have a really long-term lease because the when of payments matter as much as how much the payments are. And we'll get to that too. But effective rent is your base rent plus your CAM fees plus any other tenant paid expenses minus any cash allowances and free rent that the owner is giving back, and divide that by the square footage, and that's what you're effectively paying in rent. It's kind of like if you have a loan that you're taking for residential property, and you might be getting a certain rate, but then you're paying 2 points or 3 points, and you're paying other lender fees. So in the truth in lending statement, they divide those numbers back into the amount that you're actually paying, and it gives you a different number than the rate you have. That's actually factoring it back in. Effective rent is the same idea. We're trying to figure out effectively what the tenant is really paying. So for example, if a tenant is negotiating for a 3,000 square foot space for 3 years and has a base rent of $12 per square foot for the first year, but it's going to go up 50 cents per square foot each year, and there's going to be CAM charges paid by the tenant, and they're a fixed rate. They're $4.25 per square foot, but they go up 25 cents per year per foot. The landlord is going to give 3 months free rent, just to make your head hurt a little bit more, plus a $3,000 cash contribution as a moving expense to entice them to move into the building. So what are they really paying? Are they paying 12 bucks a square foot? Are they paying 12 plus 425 and they're getting some money back? What in the world are they paying? So to calculate the effective rent, we first have to compute the gross occupancy cost for each year. And by the way, we talk a little bit about REI Wise, which is now called RealNex. They have a part of that software package that allows you to plug this stuff in, check off the boxes that say what the CAM charges are, what type of lease it is, and so on, and set up a comparison of rents to try and figure this out. But if you're trying to do it by hand, what you're going to do is compute the gross occupancy cost for each year. How much is it going to cost me to occupy that space for the whole year? And the gross occupancy cost equals the base rent plus anything the tenant's paying minus the contributions and free rent from the landlord. So if we're in year one, remember we're paying $12 a square foot. We're renting 3,000 square feet. That equals $36,000. But the landlord's giving us 3 months free, so we're going to back off $9,000 from that rent. And then the first year, we're left with a base cost of $27,000. Base rent in year one is $12 times 3,000 less 3 months. But we have to add to that the tenant paid expenses to determine what the tenant is actually paying. Now remember, they're paying $4.25 per square foot for CAM charges, but the landlord is giving them $3,000 moving expense. So we add that in, we subtract the $3,000, and we come up with a first year cost, a gross cost of $36,750. Sounds like a pretty good deal to the tenant. Gross cost year one is base rent plus tenant paid expenses minus contribution. But then we get to years 2 and 3. Now in years 2 and 3, we don't get that $3,000 cash contribution. We don't get those 3 months free rent. So our rental rate jumps. Remember, it goes up from 12 bucks to $12.50, and then we're paying for the whole year. So we've got $37.5 in costs in the first year, plus tenant paid expenses went up a little bit. So we've got $51,000 in cost for year 2, and year 3 goes up a little bit more, another $53,250. So let's add all that together, and we find out over 3 years we're paying $141,000 to lease this space. And we want to figure out what our effective rent is per square foot. So we're going to take that $141,000 and divide it by 3 years and divide it by 3,000 square feet. And we're going to find that it costs us, on average, $15.67 per square foot. Now again, I told you the when of payments matters as much as the amount of payments. So it might be more important to the tenant to get that cheaper rent the first year, and they might be willing to pay more rent in the second and third year in order to get that. Now, cash allowances paid by the owner might include a relocation allowance, a buyout of an existing lease in order to move a tenant, a direct cash contribution, or even some non-monetary concession. In some markets, an alternative definition for effective rent is the rent actually received by the landlord after all the concessions are considered. Now, before I get into the when of payments, I want to segue for a minute into subleasing. When a tenant has a space contracted for lease but isn't using that space, or they're not using all of that space, they'll often attempt to locate another business and sublet to that new tenant. Under a sublease, this will make your head hurt too, the subleasee or subtenant pays rent to a sublessor who pays the landlord. One pays the next, who pays the next. The original tenant remains responsible for the original terms of the lease to the landlord of the property. The landlord in this situation becomes what's known as a master lessor. Now, there's some risks and some rewards for subleasing. There's certainly pros and cons. For example, subleases are often offered at better rental rates, maybe below market, because the current tenant is leasing to cover some of their cost, and because there are inherent issues with subleasing that are not common in direct leases from a landlord to a tenant. Subleases are also often rented without CAM charges paid by a direct tenant. In addition to lower rental rates, a commercial sublease or sublet are often finished spaces, so the subleasee doesn't have to build out the space for their own use. And the space might also include equipment like phone system, furniture, maybe a copier. One of the risks of subleasing space, however, is that the lease is limited to the existing end date, the existing term. That's part of the original tenant's contract. And this may obligate the subleasee to move, to relocate their business at the end of the term, or to go back to the master landlord and negotiate with them at the end of the term, which is certainly going to adversely impact their reduced rental rate. Additionally, the tenant or the sublessor could default on the lease. For example, the tenant could collect rent from the subleasee and just not pay the landlord. We've had clients that this has happened to, which would result in the sublessor losing the space and being required to relocate their business on short notice. There's also something called an assignment of lease. It's an alternative to a straight sublease. A tenant might have the right in their lease to have that lease assigned to a third party with the permission of the landlord. While this practice typically still doesn't release the tenant from the liability under the lease, an assignment transfers the space to another business for the remaining term of the lease. And unlike a sublease where the subleasee or subtenant pays the tenant who pays the landlord, the assigned leasee in the assignment pays the landlord directly, effectively becoming a new tenant for the space. The original tenant under the assignment of lease relinquishes all interest in the lease. If the new tenant fails to pay the landlord, however, the landlord generally has recourse against the original tenant unless the landlord is willing to write a release of their original tenant, and they're usually not. So how do we analyze these leases for the best value to our clients? As rental payments and expenses vary dramatically in how they're calculated from lease to lease, spaces under consideration by a tenant should be analyzed for the cost to the tenant. A few minutes ago I talked about effective rent, which allows a quick apples to apples comparison of the overall cost per square foot. But again, it doesn't compare the total cost of occupying one space versus another. So another method of comparing lease space is to calculate the total occupancy cost of each space over the entire term of the lease. And the total occupancy cost includes rent, any CAM charges, any estimated utility charges paid by the tenant, improvement costs, and other occupancy costs paid by the tenant, and any entry or exit expenses. Now remember, some landlords will contribute towards tenant improvements, and some landlords will assist with moving or entry costs to the property. If the landlord is including a period of free rent or rent abatement, this should also be factored in. So let's do an example. Wayne Enterprises, good old Wayne Enterprises, is considering two spaces for their new R&D lab in Gotham. The first space they're considering is 3,000 square feet. It's being leased on a gross lease or a full service lease for $20 a square foot. Landlord's paying everything. In fact, the landlord's willing to give 3 months free rent and cover the first year's operating expenses, but they're going to use a base stop. So the tenant's going to pay the difference between the base year and the lease year if the expenses rise. The current expenses are about $4.25 a month, but they're expected to rise at about 3% a year, along with inflation. Additionally, Wayne needs 10 parking spaces at about $20 per parking space, and Wayne expects to pay about $20,000 in improvements to move into the space and set up their R&D lab. So what is their total occupancy cost? So to determine that total occupancy cost, we have to add, let me back up here a second, we've got to add the base rent and all possible costs, including tenant improvements. The tenant paid expenses are calculated above the base year. That base year was $4.25 times 3,000 square feet, or $12,750. If the expenses are growing at 3% each year, The tenant portion of that amount above $12,750 each year is something that is expected to be paid by the tenant. So in this case, if you add up each year, your total occupancy cost down at the bottom is almost $321,000. And if we divide it backward by the number of square feet, for the total period of that 5 years, they're paying about $107 per square foot to occupy that space. Building B, the second building Wayne is considering, we're calling the Harlequin, is larger than the first. It's 3,200 square feet. And it's being leased on a triple net lease where the base rent is $12 per square foot per year. And the tenant is responsible for expenses of $475. Sorry, let me back up. The tenant's responsible for $475 per year, which are expected to rise at 3% a year, just like the other building. The landlord of the second building is also offering a 3-month rent abatement, and parking is also $20 per $20 per spot. So in the second building, the cost of improvements is $20,000, but the landlord is going to give a tenant allowance for $10,000, which will effectively bring the cost to Wayne down to $10,000. So again, we plug all these numbers in. We have the base rent, the tenant paid expenses, and in this case, the base rent is cheaper, but the tenant paid expenses are much higher. But the landlord's paying $10,000 of the improvements. So if we add all that together over the 5-year holding period, it comes out to $285,000. And if you divide that back by the square footage, it's only $89 a square foot. So if we're comparing the two scenarios, building A is more expensive in total cost than building B. On a per square foot basis, building B is an even better value because it's a bigger building at 3,200 square feet and it's being leased at about $89 a square foot. Now, the shortcoming of the total occupancy cost calculation is, again, it does not count for time value of money. And the cost of occupancy is spread out over the term of the lease, and the when of payments can affect the overall cost of the tenant as much as the amount of the payments. For example, if the cost to occupy one space is lower overall, but the initial cost, such as tenant improvements, is very high, the tenant may ultimately benefit by selecting an alternative because the cost today is worth more than the cost in the future. So a method of comparing the two properties by their cost over time is to compute a net present value of the total occupancy cost of each property under consideration. I know you wanted to hear that term again. So selecting an appropriate discount rate is important here as well. The process creates a net effective rate, which is the effective rate adjusted for the time, adjusted for the net present value of each payment. For example, if a full service lease calls for $20 per square foot for the first year, $22 per square foot in the second year, and $24 per square foot in the third year with no other expenses, and the client has an assumed cost of capital of 8% or a discount rate of 8%, we can discount those payments back to today to figure out what it's really costing us in today's dollars. And then we do it the same way we did with trying to find the net present value of a property in the last segment, which is $20 divided by 1 plus the interest rate, the discount rate that we're looking at, to the power of the year. So $20 over 1.08 for the first year, $22 over 1.08 squared to the second year, and then $24 divided by 1.08 cubed, or to the third power because it's a third year, and that gives us an idea of what it's actually running us. Now this sounds like a lot of work. However, the RealNext software, the RAIY software, actually does this for you and allows you to plug in numbers and have the software compute the best values for your tenant and spit out a nice report that shows the comparisons. In addition to occupancy costs, there are other variables to consider when seeking the best property to lease. How a firm or an individual compares spaces depends on what's most important to them. For example, the most important consideration for a tenant may be location. A retail tenant targeting high-income earners will certainly be more likely to lease in an upscale shopping complex rather than a neighborhood center in a depressed location, regardless of the rental rate differential. And similarly, an office tenant may want to open on an avenue location in New York City rather than on a side street, and that firm may be willing to pay significantly more for that address. A leasing agent should assist their clients in prioritizing their objectives because price may not be the single influencing factor. In fact, when we look at certain areas in New York, Fifth Avenue. Some of the retail stores pay north of $3,000 per square foot per year for retail space. And many of them do that at a significant loss because they think the recognition of having a flagship store on Fifth Avenue is more important than the cost or the amount of money that they're losing to have the store there, because they sell more stuff online, they sell more stuff at their other stores across the country. So that location could be the determining factor regardless of how much more they're paying in rent. And a real estate professional should assist the prospective tenant in determining both the space's total occupancy cost and in ranking the space under the most significant variables, including the location, the size of space, the required lease term, and positives and negatives about each. Next area I want to talk about is letter of intent. Generally, the first step in developing a lease for a commercial space is for the prospective tenant or tenant's representative to create a proposal for leasing that space. This proposal or this letter of intent outlines the general terms of the lease and expedites the process of negotiation, as formal leases take time to prepare, and it circumvents the expense of attorneys preparing a full lease when the general terms might not be agreed on. Once the general terms are negotiated and the landlord and tenant reach a preliminary agreement, one of the parties' attorneys generally takes over and can draft a formal lease, which often requires additional negotiations for specific terms and contingency clauses. A letter of intent is going to include a lot of different points. That might be 2 or 3 or 4 pages. It should always include the parties to the lease, a simple statement of the landlord and tenants and under what name or LLC the tenants are going to take possession and sign the lease. It should also describe the premises being leased. That may sound simple, but it might not be. You need a specific description of the unit or space being leased, which might include an attached highlighted diagram of that space if the space being leased is an interior space. You might spell out details of the space to define it. For example, Unit 2A on the southwest corner of the second floor of 121 Broadway in the city of Burbank, California, containing approximately 1,250 square feet. It should have the lease term. And that section should include both the length of the term as well as the commencement date of the lease. If the lease is predicated on improvements or renovations to the space, then the letter of intent should spell out when the tenant expects the renovations to be completed, when they expect occupancy, and when that proposed rent shall begin. For example, the section might read that the lease shall commence when proposed improvements are substantially complete, but not later than December 1st of 2017. And it shall continue for a period of 60 months. It should also have any proposed rent and escalations. What type of lease is it? Is it a gross lease, a net lease, a triple net lease? And how much are they paying? And is it going to go up over time? What are the escalations? And then other expenses and other financial obligations should be included as well. What expenses are the landlord and tenant each responsible to pay? What is the tenant planning on using the property for? These are all important for the landlord to effectively decide whether or not they want to lease to this tenant. The use of the premises may be significant for several reasons. In retail, the property often has restrictions on the type of tenants or number of tenants in any particular category, such as food service. And in industrial, property owners may want to carefully consider the potential environmental issues with one prospective tenant over another. Signage is important as well. A section outlining the anticipated signage or signage required by the tenant should also be included in the letter of intent, and an outline of tenant improvements and financial responsibility for improvements. What renovations, what alterations, what repairs is the tenant requesting, and who's going to be responsible for making those renovations? In retail, the tenant is often responsible for those renovations, while in office, the landlord often does the renovations but amortizes that cost back into the lease. A diagram of the renovations can be attached to the letter of intent, and even a renovation cost per square foot might be identified. And you also want to put in any renewal or expansion options if the tenant is planning on possible expansions. You need to discuss this in the beginning in the letter of intent, rather than when you're negotiating a final lease, you've each spent a couple $1,000s on it. And renewal options might be included in the proposal. And then you'll also include a binding or non-binding statement. See, there's an inherent risk of putting any proposal in writing in that one party or the other might argue in court that the written statement was binding on the parties. Any letter of intent should include a statement as to whether or not the letter is binding. Although the majority of letters of intent are non-binding until a formal lease is drafted and negotiated, there are times when a tenant requests a letter of intent to be binding in order to tie up the property or secure the property in the event there are other parties out there interested in leasing the premises. And then, of course, letters of intent should always be signed by the appropriate parties, whoever is authorized to sign. There's also something called a request for proposal, or an RFP. An RFP, or a request for proposal, is a request from a tenant for a proposal from the landlord regarding their best offer to the tenant for the space the landlord has available. Although it's very similar to a letter of intent, the RFP puts the onus on the landlord to make a proposal to the tenant. This technique is often employed by national tenants with strong credit. Landlords want tenants for the tenant's stability, and because strong tenants have a tendency to attract other strong tenants. Additionally, when a property is sold to an investor in the future, the investor is more likely to buy at a lower cap rate or a higher sales price if the tenant is very strong. The request for proposal is sent by the tenant or by the tenant's representative to one or more property owners that are leasing space that's suitable for that tenant. Now, the RFP contains a detailed description of the tenant's business and the requirements for space, as well as the tenant's financial capacity and possibly a little bit of the tenant's business history. The tenant requests the property owner or management provide a copy of their standard lease, as well as the best terms that might be offered to a strong credit tenant. Now remember, we talked about CVS. If CVS is taking a space and it's owned by the corporation, or it's going to be leased by the corporation, that's a strong tenant. Remember, a buyer or an investor is going to pay more, buy that at a lower cap rate, because they're fairly certain that tenant isn't going to bail on them. And property owners or property managers are encouraged to present a proposal back to the tenant, effectively bidding for the tenant's lease of their space. So if the property owner chooses to participate, they're going to respond with many of the same points that you'll find in a letter of intent, including the lease rate the owner will accept, the lease terms, escalation clauses, and so on. And they may even offer rent abatements, tenant allowances, or property improvements. While a letter of intent lays out the major points of a lease, it's really only the first phase of negotiation. Each part of the process of leasing commercial space includes some form of negotiation. You'll find you also negotiate during the design and build-out phase of the space, during the draft lease prepared by the landlord's attorney, and potentially even prior to signing a formal lease. So let's run through some of the major points of a lease. The term of the lease. Lease terms vary from 1 month to 99 years, depending on the needs of the landlord and tenants. Typically, commercial leases, however, range between 1 and 5 years in most suburban markets. The length of the lease or the term of the lease is a critical factor in negotiation. Tenants who prefer short lease terms may be concerned about their changing needs for space over time. However, short-term leases may hurt a tenant who might be replaced by a higher paying tenant next year. There is a cost for the tenant to move an office or retail business from one location to another, as well as including relocating a phone system, furniture, and simply all the time that's involved to make a move. Retail businesses may suffer when customers can't find them. However, shorter-term leases provide flexibility to a tenant if the tenant finds the need to expand or contract or close in the future. Long-term leases might be beneficial to either the tenant or the landlord, depending on what the rate of increase of the rental payment might be. If a tenant locks in a specific rental rate for 3 to 5 years, a landlord may suffer a paper loss if rental rates in the area rise significantly over the term of the lease. Similarly, if overbuilding in an area leads to a reduction in the rental rates, the tenant might be locked into paying higher than typical rent in the area by a longer lease. But as a rule, property owners typically desire long-term leases to strong tenants with built-in escalation clauses. The preferred lease to a tenant is to sign a shorter lease with a built-in renewal at a predetermined rate at the discretion of the tenant to exercise that renewal. The next part of the next clause would be commencement date of the lease. We talked about this before, but while commencement date appears straightforward, there are actually 3 dates that have to be described in the final lease. What date does the lease start? That's the start date of the lease. That might be the execution when everybody signs it. At this point, the tenant may have access to the space to run wiring and begin construction, and if the tenant's responsible for their own construction. It should be carefully spelled out in the lease. The next is the date the tenant takes possession of the property, which might be a specific date because the space is move-in ready and only requires minor changes, or that date might be fluid if the lease is predicated on a build-out or substantial improvements or renovations to the space. Landlords and tenants seldom have complete control over how long contractors take to complete the construction and how long a municipality takes to inspect the work and issue an occupancy certificate. And then the final date is when the rent begins, when the tenant starts paying rent. And although it's negotiable, rent should begin when the renovations are substantially complete. I said that earlier, but the lease should include language that substantially complete or similar language, because a tenant can't hold back rent based on minor finishes or a final punch list on improvements. If the space can be occupied and business can be conducted, the lease should commence. If the tenant intentionally or unintentionally delays the improvements due to change orders or failures to submit municipal requirements in a timely fashion, the lease may give the landlord the right to begin collecting rent regardless of whether renovations are complete. And then, of course, there's also the ending date of the lease. The lease might have a specific commencement date, a specific termination date. But if the lease is predicated on substantial improvements, the end date of the lease should be adjusted in the lease to avoid shortchanging the tenant or landlord of the full value of the lease. For example, if a tenant signs a 5-year lease beginning in January of the first year and ending at the end of the year in year 5, and then finds out that construction that they thought was going to be 30 days is suddenly delayed for 6 months for whatever reason, the lease shouldn't be shortened by this delay. A lease may be written for a period of time rather than a specific date in order to avoid this potential issue. A clause might be structured to include the language that the lease shall commence when proposed improvements are substantially complete, but no later than December 1st, 2017, and shall continue for a period of 60 months. You also have the clauses that deal with rent and escalations. Rent is one component, as we've talked about, of the overall cost of the tenant to occupy the space. Rent must be carefully negotiated. But a second consideration in rent expense is the frequency of adjustment and the method of adjustment of that rental rate. During the initial term of the lease, rent might be held stable or it might be increased at scheduled intervals. Those increases may be based on a fixed rate of increase or based on a consumer price index, a CPI adjustment, or based on a scheduled renegotiation. A fixed increase, which is, and this is, by the way, a CPI index, a fixed increase, which is the most common form of an increase, might be a specific figure per square foot, might go up 50 cents per square foot or $1 a square foot, or it might be increased by a percentage, 3% each year. A CPI adjustment is based, as the name implies, on a consumer price index, either a local one or a national one. And the argument for this form of escalation is that it keeps rent in line with inflation. A CPI index generally has a floor, so the rental rate can't go down below the base year or prior year. And scheduled renegotiations typically don't happen during the primary lease period. You figure you have a 5-year lease, and at the end of 5 years, you schedule to renegotiate the lease. And sometimes that lease rate is based on the fair market rent in the area, and you may have an appraiser and the landlord may have an appraiser, and they may obtain appraisals of what the rental rate should be and then negotiate from there to come up with the average of that for the new negotiated rent. And then rent abatements. We talked about this earlier. A reduction in the base rent or the advertised rent of a property can lead other tenants in the property to try and renegotiate or create a problem for the landlord or property manager leasing the next space. Let me say it a different way. If you are moving into a shopping center and that shopping center has had a space empty forever, and everybody in the shopping center is paying $16 or $18 per square foot, and the landlord will be thrilled to get 12 right now. The problem is, if they rent it to you for 12 bucks a square foot, everybody else is going to scream. So instead, they still rent it to you for that 18 bucks a square foot. but they give you 3 or 4 months free rent to compensate for the higher rental rate. Landlords would rather negotiate some period of free rent to bring down to entice the tenant to lease the space rather than bring down the rate. And then security deposits. Landlords of commercial property often require the last month's rent or 2 months' rent as a security deposit on the space. Some landlords request a security deposit even higher. Again, this really depends if you're in an urban area or suburban area. Tenants try to minimize their upfront cash as they have significant cost when moving a business into a new space. So depending on the language of the security deposit clause, that deposit may be used for unpaid rent, for the repair of damage to the property, or even for altering the space once the tenant leaves. And while a security deposit helps to insure the landlord against a sudden default by the tenant, the deposit effectively ties up the tenant's funds for the term of the lease, which might be 3 or 5 or 10 years long, and their money's tied up for all that time. So this cost to the tenant is greater than the funds themselves because the tenant loses that opportunity cost of taking those funds and investing them in another vehicle, whether it's investing it back in their own business or putting it in another investment. National companies try to use their size to argue that there's less risk of default and then they avoid a security deposit. But when reviewing a security deposit clause, the tenant and landlord need to spell out what constitutes a default of the lease, what cures are possible to the release of the security deposit to the landlord, and at what point the security deposit might be released back to the tenant. There are some alternatives to a security deposit. They include letter of credit or a personal guarantee. In effect, a letter of credit is an open line of credit from a lender that secures the landlord against a tenant default. While this instrument frees up the cash a tenant would normally have used for security deposit, lenders often require additional collateral, such as negotiable securities or a lien against some defined collateral which can't be sold or liquidated while the credit line is open. Unfortunately, not all businesses can obtain a line of credit either, or letter of credit either. Another one is a personal guarantee. That's a legal guarantee that the tenant or partners of the business guarantee the amount of the security deposit personally. If the business fails or fails to fulfill the terms of the lease, the landlord can take that to the court and attach assets of the business, or the tenants may be able to, or even their personal property. And tenants may be able to negotiate a clause in the lease that reduces the security deposit or reduces the liability under a letter of credit or personal guarantee over time. So if lease is 5 years, the tenant may negotiate to have 20% of the deposit returned each year, or a 20% reduction in that guarantee. This process is known as the burn down of a deposit. The burn down of a deposit. Let's skip over to use clauses. Landlords want to know how their space is being used by the tenant. Landlords of shopping centers try to shape the center to attract the maximum visitors and often make promises to tenants about the percentage of the center that will be dedicated to one type of business versus another. We've had a couple of tenants recently that are trying to open marijuana stores in some cities, and they're finding difficulty getting into shopping centers because the shopping centers are restricting certain uses. It's always interesting what we have to deal with. And of course, a high-end shopping center with very high-end stores sometimes want to make sure they don't have a discount store in the same shopping center. And industrial landlords want to ensure that their property isn't used for a purpose that may contaminate the property and require significant cleanup expense. Office landlords might have a tenant that has an exclusivity clause that forbids any other dentists in the building or any other title insurance companies in the building. So tenants need to be careful that the restrictions listed on the use clauses are broad enough to allow for any business that they might conduct. Some use clauses are intentionally structured to be very restrictive. A variation of a use clause is a restrictive use clause, which outlines what business activities the tenant is restricted from doing in their space. So a tenant might be restricted from selling vacuum cleaners, for example, if another tenant has the exclusive right to sell vacuum cleaners in that building. Alternately, a tenant may request their own exclusivity clause. I'm going to be the coffee shop here, so I don't want a Dunkin' Donuts or a Starbucks on the other end. And I don't want to have a direct competitor in the same commercial property, so I put that in as my own restrictive use clause. We also want to make sure to put into a lease the option to renew and subletting clauses. We've talked about this, but it has to be in the lease. Tenants have to prepare for the possibility of the business being better or worse than expected. And at some point, the tenant may want to expand their space, or at least renewal time, they want to be able to extend it. So if a renewal clause is not part of the initial lease, the landlord doesn't have to honor it if they believe they can find a replacement tenant at a higher rate that's going to provide more value to the property. Now, in the event that the tenant doesn't need as much space or needs to move from the property, as described earlier, a tenant may need to sublet their space to cover the rent or even assign the lease to a third party. The parties need to negotiate through the representatives to determine the terms. And then property improvements. Is the tenant paying for improvements? Is the landlord agreeing to pay for improvements? Will the landlord pay for improvements up front and charge the tenant back over time in the rent payment? Is the tenant permitted to do renovations after they occupy the space? And must the tenants receive written permission from the landlord for renovations or improvements? And we're going to get into property improvements in a little bit. And there's also a maintenance clause. And a maintenance clause spells out which party, the landlord or tenant, is going to be responsible for care, maintenance, and repair of the property. The clause might separate duties based on the interior of the space, the exterior, and the common areas, or they may be delineated by what is considered a major repair versus a minor repair. A maintenance clause may also determine which party is responsible if the municipality comes in, the city, the borough, the township, and requires updates or upgrades, or that might be included in a compliance clause. Insurance clauses. Tenants are responsible for maintaining insurance on their own contents within the space they're leasing. They are generally also required to purchase liability insurance, which lists the landlord as an additional insured party. Other insurances are often negotiated between the landlord and tenant in order to protect both parties. So a lease should spell out who's responsible for any insurance and what it's going to cover. There's also one called a tenant relocation clause. Let me explain that. Leases for shopping centers and office buildings may contain the language that the landlord may require the tenant to move to another location in the building. This clause is commonly used to protect the landlord's ability to provide expansion to some major tenant in the building. For example, if a large grocery store is in the center of a shopping center surrounded by smaller retailers, and to keep them in that center, they need to be able to expand, the landlord may be forced to satisfy the grocery store rather than lose that major tenant by shifting the adjoining tenants to other spaces. If this clause is a requirement of the landlord, a tenant might protect themselves somewhat by negotiating that the landlord pay moving expenses for an additional monetary figure for the possible temporary loss of income and inconvenience of the tenant. Now, one we get asked about very often is the subordination clause and non-disturbance clause. Let me explain this the best I can. A subordination clause works like this. The lender for a commercial property might require any lease to have language in the lease to subordinate the lease to the lender's mortgage. So if the property owner, the landlord, the person who owns the shopping center or the office building defaults on their mortgage, and the lender forecloses, the lender has the right to immediately terminate that lease. Now, obviously, tenants don't want to be evicted by the lender when they've got no control over whether or not the landlord pays their mortgage. Tenants have a strong stake in remaining in that space. They may make significant investments in that space in terms of tenant improvements. And tenants may also establish a business at a particular location, and a simple move might create a loss of that business. So the negotiation of the removal of a subordination clause might be beyond the control of the landlord because it might be a requirement of the lender. And even without a subordination clause, a lease that's signed after a new mortgage is placed on a property is generally automatically subordinated to the mortgage. So a method to mitigate the risk for a tenant is to ask the lender to sign what's called a non-disturbance agreement with the tenant. And a non-disturbance agreement is a clause or a document that requires the lender to leave the tenant in place after foreclosure as long as the tenant continues to abide by the original lease and continues making rent payments and other expense charges. Both the subordination clause and the non-disturbance clause may be included in the lease, or they may be written into a separate agreement that's also signed by the lender. Some of the other things that are common clauses: parking, signs, landlord entry. Leases need to itemize and explain all the tenant rights and landlord rights and responsibility. Will any parking be designated to a particular tenant? Is there a fee for parking? How will it be segregated from the other tenant's space? What kind of business signs are allowed on the property, and how may they be positioned? By the way, let me go back up to how will it be segregated from other tenants' space. What happens if you have a jewelry store going in and you've just got drywall between the spaces? You have to be able to protect that store, so they want to know what's going to be between them. Does the landlord have the right to enter tenant space at will? Same problem. What if you've got a business that has very, very expensive items in that space? Do you want somebody coming in and potentially knocking over one of those $10,000 vases or whatever the situation is? Must the landlord provide notice, or can the landlord only enter in the event of an emergency? See, attorneys who regularly write commercial leases are going to develop libraries of lease clauses, including some standard common clauses that they can plug right into leases, as well as alternate versions that might be more appropriate for some situations, or might be more acceptable to some landlords and tenants who have issues with the common versions. An experienced attorney who can provide this service is often going to shorten the time frame of drafting a lease. There's also what we call trigger event clauses, or what I call just-in-case clauses. Attorneys can add a myriad of different clauses to leases to cover every possible issue that might arise, and I'm fairly certain many of these attorneys are paid by the word. These clauses can range from a tenant or landlord violating any part of the lease. They can include what happens in the event of a fire, a flood, a hurricane, a landslide, a nuclear war, flying pigs, or an alien attack. I actually did have a lease once with a pretty large national company that had an alien attack actually in the lease, as well as nuclear war. These clauses are written to outline the rights of the landlord and tenant and what remedies are available to the injured party. And then there is the default clause. If a tenant doesn't pay the rent, if they fail to pay the rent by the due date, how long does the landlord have before they can seize possession of that lease space? Is it 2 weeks, a month, 3 months? And what remedies are available to the tenant to rectify the situation, to bring it up to date? A default may be abandonment of the space, or it might be failure to pay rent, or the bankruptcy of the tenant. A default clause spells out what the landlord or tenant's rights are in a default. Typically, leases outline how quickly the landlord can terminate the lease and recapture that space under default, what the landlord might do with any assets or furniture or equipment that's left in the space after abandonment, and how the security deposit might be used to correct damages or pay for unpaid rent. A little bit different than a default clause is a breach clause. A breach clause might be a default, but the clause generally has a broader definition. What happens if either party breaches a lease? Is there a remedy, or does the landlord have the right to evict the tenant? Does the tenant have right to damages if the landlord breaches? For example, I open a coffee shop on one side of the shopping center with an exclusivity clause, and they rent the other side to Starbucks. Do I have, what are my tenant rights? Do I have the right to damages against that landlord? What if a tenant does pay the rent, but they're chronically late? Any failure of a tenant or landlord to perform any part of the lease might be considered a breach. There's also damage and destruction clauses. A damage and destruction clause is not a maintenance clause. If a property is substantially damaged, a tenant may be able to conduct their business, or a tenant may be unable to conduct their business if a property is substantially damaged. A damage or destruction clause outlines the level or extent of destruction and remedies to the parties. For example, if one side of the building is damaged by fire, while the tenant's side only receives minor smoke damage, the landlord may have a certain period of time to correct any damage that may affect the tenant's ability to use the space for their business, or the lease might be terminated. Rent may be abated during the period of cleaning or reconstruction. Now, if the building is substantially destroyed, the lease is typically terminated with no further obligation of the tenant to that landlord. If the tenant's space is damaged, the tenant must immediately notify the landlord. And by the way, if the damage was done as a result of actions of the tenant, then generally the tenant doesn't have any right to cancel the lease. If the damage was a result of vandalism or an act of God, then the landlord will have a reasonable period of time to make repairs or rebuild that space before the tenant has a right to terminate the lease. And landlord and tenant improvements. Now, while most spaces need to be redefined or updated or built out when a commercial or office tenant moves into the space, the burden of the improvement partly depends on the type of space being leased and partly on the negotiation between the landlord and the tenant through their representation. Retail space, for example, is generally delivered as a blank slate, with the tenant left to manage and finance all the improvements. While some retail property owners will finish the space and amortize the cost into their lease, tenants like restaurants and franchise services require equipment to be incorporated into their space and are far more likely to finance their own improvements. Alternately, a common element in office space leases is the negotiation and the financial responsibility for improvements to the space being leased. Tenants will often want to reconfigure or improve the property to meet their business needs. Landlords may be willing to make the capital improvements that are going to increase the overall value of the property, but they're unlikely to want to make specific improvements that would benefit only one specific tenant unless those improvements are included in the rental payment by amortizing that cost into the rental rate. For this reason, properties being leased with improvements specific to the tenant are often leased for very long periods of time, at least 5 years, 7, 10 years, in order to incorporate the cost of those improvements back into the lease. And the lease should also spell out whether or not the tenant is permitted to make improvements or renovations to the space without the landlord's written permission. Although tenant improvements will often improve the value of the property, there are renovations that are so specific to a particular tenant, it might devalue the space when the tenant moves. Space planning. In addition to the capital to build out or renovate space, improvements require planning and management. An initial design is done by an architect at the bequest of the tenant. Although this plan becomes the basis for working drawings to build out the space, there are several parties who have to agree to the plan. The property owner or landlord wants to approve any changes to the space and make sure in the lease that the space is put back in its original condition when the tenant vacates if it's very unique. Municipal governments often have requirements for review of plans and oversight of the project by way of approvals during each phase of the construction. The contractor for the space may also have suggestions or changes during the construction phase. And finally, key employees in the tenant's firm are likely to have input into designs, including their offices within the space. And often these plans go through several iterations before final design is completed and signed off by all parties. The plan needs to be detailed enough that the tenant or landlord might obtain bids from contractors on the construction of those improvements. So we move on to tenant allowances. How are we going to pay for these things? How are we going to make it work? So as with every part of a commercial lease, the tenant allowances are negotiated between the landlord and the tenant. The two most common methods landlords offer to have space renovated are either what's called a turnkey build-out or a stated improvement cost. It's very much like new construction of a house. Under a turnkey build-out, the landlord pays all or most of the cost to build out the space. Now, while this may be preferable to many tenants, consider this. Landlord is likely to factor in an additional contingency cost in case the project runs over. They're also going to include project management cost into the construction, driving up the cost to be amortized into the tenant's lease. And additionally, landlord may be in charge of the quality of materials installed and control the construction process. So an alternative is the stated contribution. If the landlord instead says, I'm going to give you $52,000 to renovate this to your heart's content. They provide a specific amount towards the tenant's build out. The tenant then has control over the cost. There's a risk with this as well. And it's the potential cost overruns because the tenant is probably inexperienced in construction. The tenant's rarely an expert, and they're unlikely to be capable of managing that construction project themselves, including permits and inspections. So they're going to have to rely on a contractor or a construction management team. In either case, in a turnkey build-out or stated improvement contribution, the tenant allowance has to be carefully calculated to ensure that it covers the cost of improvements. Some landlords and management companies use standardized figures to offer toward tenant allowances. For example, their calculation might include 200 feet of interior walls in a certain size space. That would include 8 lights and 32 outlets per every 1,000 square feet of space. This may also be based on average or lower grade materials. So a tenant has to consider, based on the architectural drawings, what improvements do they need, what quality materials do they need, and be certain that allowances cover the build out. So I'm going to leave you today with a few quick assignments on this section of the program, section 4, so you can improve your knowledge and understanding of lease and lease terms. Why? You're telling me I have to do assignments? Absolutely, because you're going to learn by doing. So the first thing I want you to do is to go to your local multiple listing system or whatever system you use to find local commercial properties for lease. And I want you to select a few properties that are listed as net lease properties. I want you to call the listing agent and find out what expenses are required for the tenant to pay as part of the lease. That's going to help you to understand how the terms are expressed locally. Second, I want you to take the time to visit several properties for lease in your area so you can get a feel for how much space actually costs, so you can be able to effectively communicate, effectively talk to people in the industry and people that are coming into your office. And I'd like you to sit down and compare the cost of those spaces, including any CAM charges or net charges that the tenants might pay. And finally, I want you to review any recent commercial leases in your office. Look at both office and retail leases if they're available. Read through those clauses so you get a basic understanding of what terms are common in your area. And I'm going to give you a few more quotes to think about. First, I believe that every lease can be a win for both the landlord and the tenant. Some people think that if you leave 5 cents on the table, you lost. I disagree. Bernard Baruch once said, "You don't have to blow out the other person's light to let your own shine." I believe that. Some aspects of leasing and rent negotiations can be brutal, and I'm certain you'll run across realtors and attorneys who want nothing but the perfect deal for their clients at the expense of all others. But in the end, what you really want to see is a win-win for our clients. Carl Albrecht said, "Start out with an ideal and end up with a deal." Negotiation is an art form, and while we certainly want the best possible scenario for our clients, we also want to realize that we want both parties to win. The landlord wants a successful tenant who's going to remain there for a long period of time and provide the landlord with a solid return on their investment. And the tenant wants a strong landlord who's going to maintain the building, upgrade the property, and not be subject to a foreclosure which would force the tenant to vacate the space. See, one of the greatest challenges of negotiating a lease is that emotion clouds our judgment and leads us to make poor decisions. A property owner might take offense to a comment by a tenant, or a tenant might believe that the landlord is holding out on some point of greed. And I am going to leave you with one other quote that is Howard Baker. And he said the most difficult thing in any negotiation, almost, is making sure you strip it of all emotion and deal with the facts. The greatest value of a real estate professional in leasing is not marketing the property or securing appointments with a client, but it's rather in acting as a third party between the tenant and the landlord to help facilitate a transaction that's going to benefit both of them. Again, I'm Loren Keim with Real Estate's Next Level and Lehigh University's Goodman Center for Real Estate Studies. Thank you for watching section number 4, or the fourth part of the Century 21 Introduction to Commercial Real Estate, and I'll see you in section 5.